If, however, you have indigestion from the amount of material that's been thrown at you, that's fine, and we can leave it there. Certainly these issues are going to be picked up very strongly within the debate within the school, but for those of you from outside the school, if you wish to have a discussion, we can do so. I'll just wait a couple of minutes to see how the room settles. Okay, well, for people who want to stay on for a few minutes, if you can move to the front of the room, and for our panel, if they can get seated. Okay, if we could settle down now. Candido, Nabil, would you like to come and sit on these chairs here so we can just have a conversation? Would people in the audience like to move up to the front so that there's slightly less dispersion? We've been presented this morning with a very dense menu of ideas and of critiques of the process of urban development and the transformation relating to this issue of the global city and of both the trying to rethink and to understand better the forces that are acting, but also very explicitly in the proposals presented this morning, how to adjust to, how to respond to that, and what can the architectural imagination, what can the people who need to think about space and the articulation of space and its consumption do more effectively than what we have seen in many parts of the world during the 80s and early 90s, which was a very mute response, producing often very unworkable future positions for the city. So I think we could say that some of what we've seen this morning allows us to be a bit more optimistic. Certainly the discussions around the idea of Saint-André and how that is being negotiated and the spatiality that is beginning to come out of that shows that even within what has been typified as the chaos of São Paulo, there is a new discussion developing. But I'll say no more at the moment because I'm sure people in the audience will have many things to say. And who would like to start with the first point to raise to any of the speakers? In the green jacket.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask Bill a quick question to Dr. Bonduki, because I was very impressed with his presentation today on the project of renewing house project with squatted old housing. But I have two questions to raise to him. The first one is related to the ownership of the plot. He might have mentioned in the presentation, but I'm afraid I missed. My question is how the legalization process of ownership was dealt with by city authority. It is the first question. And the second one is, about impact of social gentrification afterward, after renewal project was completed. Especially I'm interested in the case when the squatters had already tenants in the slum, in their own living space before.
Did you get those points, Nabil? 2 points. Did you understood the question?
What?
Did you understand the question?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yes, well, well, there are different situations in the squatter. The main squatter was public areas, and the City Hall of São Paulo start a regularization of this land, regularization of land to become in one system. In this squatter where I show in today, but for complete this process, it's need the councils, the city council approve the regularization of the land, and this already haven't happened because there are a very strong debate between the society about the transformation the public area in housing area and housing area, but it's impossible in a city, in one city like São Paulo, in this moment with 2 million people living in a squatter, don't change this area that was designated by green area in housing area. I think this is a problem that more late or early or late is going to be resolved with the change the owner for the people.
Just to push you a little bit on that, Nabil.
Bon. Yeah, this is the problem of the expulsion of the people, of the people that go away because the value of the land increase, is a problem that there are in the cities like São Paulo, every capitalist city. It's impossible to control completely. But I think that with this process, maybe if the people go away, they can receive more money. It's one form of share the income in a very inequality society as the Brazilian society. I think this policy, in one hand or the other hand, is of course a policy of share the income. But of course, it's possible the people go away. It needs to say too that in the self-help process, it's a little people that sell his house or the land. But when the process is by company, this commercial of housing is stronger.
Next question was behind you. Could I just ask, Richard MacCormac has got to go in a couple of moments. If there's anyone who really has a burning question specifically directed to Richard's presentation, if they could go first, and then I'll come back to you afterwards. So there's one here. The microphone.
What intrigued me between what you call the local and the foreign transaction is the transaction between those transactions. And one way you illustrated that was through the street life. When you showed Brick Lane and the brewery, it seemed to me that what has emptied out that link was the workforce which is no longer in the brewery, which in my view was a sort of mediating transaction between the two. Now my question is to you, first of all, whether you see, what do you see once the street life has gone as well, for example, with just lots of traffic and stuff like that. So in other words, you don't have anymore these bounds between the foreign and the local transaction just through physical morphological change or through change in the use of the space. And secondly, how you see your analysis and how that could relate to Santo André. Sorry.
Well, I think the weakness in my argument is an analysis rather than a prescription, and I think the weakness in it is that it doesn't really address issues of land value and the idea that somehow in an area like Spitalfields, all the local Bangladeshi restaurateurs would open up little cafes under the global financial services as probably rather remote. So there's a kind of weakness in it, which is to do with value in cities. But on the other hand, if you leave that aside, I think there's a very strong argument for city planning authorities to insist that development sustains some kind of interstitial pattern of local transactions in amongst the global ones. I don't see any difficulty with that. In fact, I think a place like the City of London perceives that its image as a major international financial centre does depend upon it offering amenities to people who are working in the city that make it a good place to work in. So there's a bigger, a quite big argument, a self-interest argument, I think, in places like the City of London, that they do sustain local transactions and increase them, and that is actually happening. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Thank you. To go back to the question at the back.
Can I interject something which relates directly on that point?
Yes, okay.
Sorry to interrupt, but it relates to Richard.
Your time will come.
I saw a very good example of what Richard MacCormac is talking about a few days ago in a project presented by somebody else in his own office, which was a project for the recuperation of a neighbourhood in Dublin called Ballymun, where your partner had, among other things, elaborated a very interesting idea in a part of this area where they were proposing to attract a lot of new investors to a site beside a motorway, a very high-value location in the area, to insist two things. First of all, that the profitability of this part of the zone would be captured and used to help to finance the recuperation of the other parts of the zone, because the municipality owned the land. The other was that the new enterprises entering this area would be prevented from internalizing their own services. So the workers, this is Judith's point, so the workers employed there would go out to the shops, out to the cafe, out to the bar, out to the Xerox shop, I don't know exactly what, but you would try through the instruments of planning or through the instruments of the lease to enforce this intermediate street life that would support the smaller enterprises. It seemed to me a very creative piece of planning.
Yeah, I'm glad you reminded me of one of our own projects. Yeah. I mean, that project's also interesting in its traffic management terms, because we're trying to create a sort of Ramblas condition where we mix, a sort of high street condition where we mix pedestrians and vehicles. But just my final remark, I can't quite remember what the economic analysis was, but when one worked out the disposable income of office workers in the Spitalfields project, and you reckoned that they might spend, on average, if they went out of the buildings to have lunch, sort of £4 or £5 a head, and there might be, I don't know, 1,000 people, or maybe 2,000. No, it's over 2,000 people working there, and they might buy other things. The effect on the local transactional economy of the foreign transactions was enormous. So it's terribly important to recognise that there could be, to use that rather horrible sort of Thatcherite term, a trickle-down effect from these very big-scale enterprises if the planning allows it.
And indeed, exactly that has happened with the interim use of the empty market building while the development is frozen. A very clever proposal to do exactly that, to get the spending of that money into the local economy. Now, to move back to the question at the back. Thank you very much.
Sorry, yes.
I'm sorry, this is not a question, just a comment, and I feel like it's necessary for us to reflect about what we've been discussing since yesterday now. I want to make a hopefully brief comment about this idea of deindustrialization of Great São Paulo. We've been talking about these new projects which are going on as far as they are supposed to deal with this sort of deindustrialization, okay? But when you go to the figures, what you see is not such an really deindustrialization of the regional metropolitan area of São Paulo. São Paulo still holds over 50% of, the Great São Paulo holds over 50% of the state of São Paulo's industry. This is quite a huge concentration, right? Not only this, but Great São Paulo holds over 20% of the Brazilian industry as a whole. So it's very difficult to talk about deindustrialization in these terms, I suppose. Apart from this, what we could say when you go to places, to different municipalities of São Paulo metropolitan region, you really do see some closing down firms, plants which have no people working in there anymore. But what does this mean? In my point of view, you can see two different processes taking place. One which is related to the previous decades' investments, the Brazilian governments, both within the state and the national governments, to make efforts in order to reduce this concentration. And this is very good for the country as a whole. Okay? Deconcentrating industrial investment from São Paulo is good as far as this high level of concentration happens. And the other tendency we've come across is a slightly or quite different one, which is connected to the opening up of the Brazilian economy since the early 1990s. And this is really another process. Okay? And this process has meant closing down firms and not substituting these firms by other firms elsewhere in the country, which is very bad for the national employment rates. And this is the most preoccupating one, not the other one, which has meant employment in other places. So, I guess we can understand that it's very important for the for the regional metropolitan authorities to figure out other ways to find new functions, which is really not which is necessary for the municipalities to provide some labor, some employment, some other activities and so on. And this is a very expected process which takes place in every city which has been transformed into metropolis and huge global cities as well. I mean, reducing industrial participation in the local, regional economy is expected as it grows up, okay? But it is also necessary to see that some of these employments which have been closed down within this big town, this big city, has been diverted to other places which are not that big, land is not that much expensive, and it's creating employment in the same places where these people who migrated to São Paulo used to live before that. So you can divert the migration flows back to the original places where this labor has used to live before, which is very good, okay? And the other point is, thinking of global city in a society as divided as the Brazilian one is really important. I mean, it's necessary for us to be quite critique and profound about this thing. As far as the national market, I mean, the number of potential consumers who do not consume at all means we could put an eye back into the country and provide the conditions for us to improve this national market, so we would be producing much more activities for Brazilian employment instead of just looking towards outside the country to be connected with global flows and so on. I guess we cannot forget the global side, but we must, at least for the first time, and this is a political issue, obviously, it's necessary for us to put an eye also back into the domestic side of the story. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would anyone like to respond to that? It's, I think, particularly in relation to the very optimistic strategy of the Santander proposals, which are attempting to incorporate some of those issues, the reincorporation of industry, but in a different way, the integration with the economy at many different levels, the complexity of the intervention, not as a single function block, but as a knitting together again of the territory. Would anyone involved in that like to comment? Or shall we move straight on? We have more questions waiting. Any particular response? It was more a comment than a question. We continue. At the back there.
I just wanted to ask a detailed question, really, of Nabil Bonduki. Yesterday, if I understood you correctly, when you were talking about exclusion from the city in the analysis, I think you mentioned that you had 20 criteria when you carried out your surveys of residents in the poor area. Sorry, can you hear me? Shall I repeat?
Yes.
It's a detailed question. Yesterday, when you were talking about your surveys regarding exclusion from the city of poor people, I think you mentioned you had 20 criteria. I was interested to know what some of these criteria were, other than the usual ones, actually. Did I understand right when you said yesterday you had a survey which you used 20 criteria?
Well, there are several indexes in the education, income, health, environment condition, housing condition, What more? The women's situation in the market of the world. Education.
It's because you said 20. I was so curious to know if there were unusual ones. Yeah.
In this field, there are water, light, in the housing, the bathroom. There aren't bathroom. There aren't the density of the people per house. Several index in this field.
And could I ask a supplementary one? When you showed your housing projects today, you said, is this working? You actually showed some very nice projects which you said were self-built, and they looked as they were in brick or block or concrete. In England, when people are self-built, they've usually used timber frame because of the lack of skill. But in your projects, the standard of workmanship looked very, very good. And I was just curious to know whether the people who built them, whether they had those skills already, or whether you teach them, or how are they built?
Yes. No, exactly. What happened is in this system, the community have his self-life, and they have a technical support completely independent of the city hall. This is the system, because the system is the centralization of this activity. Claim financial to build a house, they need to present several documents, the project, the budget of the complex, several kinds of documents, and they need to present to building regulation. How the people going to build. And to do that, in several situations, the people of one community start a course of building with a professional school that there are in Brazil, Senac. Several communities have this kind of course, but it's not one need to start to build. It's important to say too that a little part of the financial support, financing, 10% of the money can go to pay the professional, the building professional, specialized, skilled workers, because that is not only completely free work of the people, but in several situations the people more specialized that is a dweller work all the week, and in the weekend they work free for the community. I can't have time to show this part of the process, but it's important to say that is a mix between free work and pay work.
Does anyone else have a question they're really urgently wanting to raise? I'm aware of the time now ticking on. I think take one last question then from Hans here. There's a microphone behind you. Make this the final question.
I found I found very interesting and extremely stimulating, really, this session here. I have a question which is related partly to Joan Busquets when he talks about the urban project, and partly also to Nabil, the new policy of social housing in connection with an urban policy. Now, it's extremely optimistic and very inspirational, actually, what you are doing, I think, both of you. But how is it actually going to be carried through over a longer period? Because the problem was also in São Paulo that after the elections had changed, and I don't really know why they changed if it was so successful, how can it go on, you know, in a longer period? And that's really what I'm very worried about.
It's a question for all. I think there are two things important to say about this. There are experience for only 4 years, but there are a process in the police house in Brazil. I think the process, this is a episode of this process. The change of the old policy of the National Housing Bank to a new policy is a process very long, and this experience had contributed for this process. It's important because São Paulo is the big city in Brazil. It have at that time had money to put in housing in a moment where the city halls generally don't have enough money for do 200 project. And at that moment, in the beginning of the 90s, this was very important in opposite of the old policy. But now, for example, one question very important, the money in national housing policy now doesn't go more to the producer of the housing, go to the dwellers, to the consumer, and they contract the project or buy a housing in the market. This is very important. This inversion, it's very important to the quality of the projects, because the people choose the better. Of course, it's a long process, and I don't know when the architecture and the housing go to be a good architecture and integration with the city, because in several other cities of Brazil, the situation is the same. The people don't or didn't review the old characteristics of these projects. I think but the political problems is a problem very, very big to speak. Why we don't have continuous policy for continuous.
I have to make a comment.
Okay, Candido.
The problem of continuity is always the same. I think all the countries depends on the public opinion, the public support. When you have in a country that shifts from a political party to the other, and these are opposite parties in terms of public policies, you have the shifting all the programs the government have to take on. When here a conservative party wins and Labour when here in the United Kingdom you have the shift from Labour Party to Conservative one, I think all the parties can be shifted. I don't say that all have been shifted, but can be shifted. When they don't, when it's so strong a backing from people from all the sections or sectors of society that the government cannot modify that. This is the question for the project of Santander. It's a very huge one. It will take more than one administration to put it forward. And the only way to guarantee the continuation of it is to have the backing of the majority of the people of Santander. Then I think this raised the question how to obtain this backing. I think that we have to discuss this very deeply with the all forces of the population. The prefect is here, and he's trying to do that. What we're trying to do, because I'm a part of the project, is to organize a discussion of it, a public discussion of it. The mayor could speak about that. And there is idea that it will take at least 4 or 5 months, I would say. In September is the proposed symposium, the Congress of the city. It will be about November. Yeah, at the end of the year. Well, this is a way to do that. Perhaps we'll have to develop strategies of public discussions. I don't know your experience here in doing this kind of thing. I would be very useful for us to learn if you have some experience on public debate of projects of this kind. But I think this is the only way to have this very strong backing from people to guarantee, to have some guarantee of this continuation.
Thanks. And yes, there is in fact very interesting experience from Britain and from other parts of Europe, but we're not going to open up that whole debate today. The last word to Joan Busquets to respond again to Hans's question.
Thank you. No, just to make a short response to the Hans proposal. No, I think this is a quite... Yeah. No, I think it's an important question to say how the urban project can help in that project. I think the experience now in Europe is that when the urban projects are focusing things that everybody in that municipality or in that region the majority of the people can share these principles, then you can create an overall consensus. Of course, if that goes properly, the municipality is re-elected. That I think is the problem, the situation in Barcelona. Barcelona as a city is a right voter in terms of the election, but for the local is left, let's say, a coalition of left. Why? Because the majority of the people feel that this program, they are happy with that program. What for me is important in terms of these discussions is when the progressive forces are able to define one project and this project got a consensus, even there is a political change, the citizens can try to back those studies. I think this is the way that long-term planning been forever. I mean, also how Barcelona did this project in 19th century when the right party was in power trying to kill the grid. But the grid stays because it was like a consensus. I think this is, when we call about consensus, you need a quite clear project to create a consensus. And this project, as far as our experience concerned, comes always from the progressive forces. They are the only forces interested in thinking ahead. That's, I think, is the way it works in the recent experience.
Thank you very much. Well, with that very strong comment, I want to bring it to a close. And as chair of the session, I'm not going to exercise any privilege in trying to make some totalizing final comment, because we've already exhausted, I think, our time and our audience. The issues that we've raised today, however, are issues which are being discussed very much in the school, And those of you who are not familiar with the AA, we're very pleased that you have come to the symposium today. And I'd like to remind you that the school is open. Many of its activities are open for public debate. That's the whole idea of much of the work in the school. And warmly invite you to come back and to continue with the very rich series of issues that have been raised today in the debate. Can I thank very warmly the panelists for their patience and their energy. It's been a very long morning. Thank you for your contributions. And to the audience for your energy in staying here for so long. Thank you very much.